First of all, let me alert everybody here that contrary to all the suggestions from serious spiritual teachers, I may be, rather than sacrificing myself or reducing my importance, I will probably end up saying things how significant I am or how important I am. So you'll have to put up with all this. But the reason I'm saying this, because it is part of my search for spiritual search, what has brought me here. So I'll speak about this, giving some personal details, which really are arrogant actually, but they may seem even more arrogant than they actually are. First of all, almost certainly I am perhaps the oldest person here. Not entirely sure of that, but I was born in 1938. In 5 weeks, I'll be 87 years old. So I don't imagine anybody else is that age. And I was 9 years old when India and Pakistan were divided. And from the veranda on my house, I could see people killing each other in the name of religion. And as a 9-year-old kid, I was so against religion that I can hardly really say anything about it. It was the last thing I was interested in, anything in the name of religion. So I anxiously avoided any connection with whatever it was called, Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism or Islam. The closest friend of my father was a Muslim lawyer. My father was a lawyer, and another Muslim lawyer was his closest friend, who had to leave that town because of this division. So you can see a whole family dispute, etc., that resulted from it. So I was really against religion as far as I could see. And secondly, in my school, there was a course taught in Sanskrit. But at the same time, there was another course there on something to do with mechanics. And my father said, "What the hell are you going to do with Sanskrit?" So I never studied any Sanskrit. I grew up just without. Otherwise, many people in India, especially at that age, it may have changed now, but at that age, they would have learned some Sanskrit on the way, and they would have. In any case, being reasonably good student, I ended up going to what was called the Indian Institute of Technology, which had just started based on MIT model, and ended up doing a Master of Technology in oil exploration. However, something in me was not satisfied because we were using most of the physics from the 19th century, not using quantum mechanics or relativity theory, which what I kept hearing about it, but we were not studying that. So I decided to shift my subject and try to go into physics, study physics, by which I really meant more modern physics. But being a reasonably good student, I had a fellowship from MIT, from Caltech, from Commonwealth Scholarship. I chose to go to Canada simply because they paid for my travel expense as well. Whereas MIT was just giving me scholarship without the travel expense. So when I arrived there at the airport, because I was on a fancy fellowship, Commonwealth, somebody picks me up. And I was almost certain that I was not going to survive because everybody driving on the wrong side of the road from the other side. Because in India, they drive on the left side of the road. But I survived. And gradually, first of all, they placed me in a house which was run by somebody from India originally. And I said, why should I come 10,000 miles away and just stay with the Indian kind of food with Indian people? I should learn something about this culture, new culture. So I shifted to another house altogether run by a Canadian people, eating Canadian kind of food, which was not so easy for me to begin with. Because Canadian food, if you think what is vegetarian food in Canada, just simply some boiled potatoes. especially at that time. Now you can actually get vegetarian food in Canada, but at that time it was not, and nobody was eating vegetarian food. Right? But very soon I was encountered by a group of people called the Varsity Christian Fellowship. That's the title of the book. And they were very eager to convert me to Christianity. They kept telling me in one way or the other that otherwise I'll go to hell if I don't become a Christian. This is a fundamental idea. But fortunately, they gave me a copy of the Bibles, only the New Testament, or what the Christians call the New Testament. Because the Old Testament is not the Old Testament from Jewish point of view, it's the Torah. It's altogether a different expression. And then, remember, I was 23 years old, and a couple of young ladies there were also trying to entertain me so that I can become a Christian. But the great advantage of what I got from that was actually receiving a copy of the Bible, and I was particularly struck by the Gospel of John more than any other gospel, actually, especially the Gospel of John. Later on, I discovered that even within the Christian tradition, that is regarded as the spiritual gospel, or since the 2nd century. I did not know any of this at that time. And I was especially struck by the quality of Christ as gets expressed in the Gospels. Not just loving your neighbors, even loving your enemies. And I said, my goodness, how could this be possible? I tried this for a moment, somebody I didn't particularly like in my class, thinking maybe I should find a way of loving him. But it was very difficult for me to actually find any kind of expression of love for this person. And since I was in the physics department, most of my fellow graduate students thought it was actually crazy of me to be interested in the Bible. As far as they were concerned, religion is just nonsense. You people have to believe this. Graduate students in the physics department are completely convinced that religion is just nonsense. But then one day I heard somebody, one of them just on my back, I heard somebody say, well, he's from India. That meant he could be crazy. He could be interested in religion because he's from India. Otherwise, the sensible person won't be interested in this. Then, of course, since I was coming from India, by the way, I should also mention here, until I came to Canada, I had never met a Christian. Although there were more Christians in India at that time, and even now, than there are in Canada. But the whole Canadian population is 3% of the population of India. So there were more Christians in India, but I may have even sat next to somebody on a bus, but they don't have horns. How would I know somebody is a Christian? So at least knowingly, I had never met a Christian until that time. And now I wanted to be intentionally eager to meet some of them to find out. So as I said, I was very struck by whatever I found out or whatever I could read about the nature of Christ himself. And then particularly his remark about almost everything he says includes the word love in it. Love your neighbors, love each other as I love you, or love your enemies. It's almost as if love is oozing out of him. All of his expression. By the way, before I even say anything else, I'm somewhat sad that here we are supposed to be interreligious, but there is not a single portrait of Christ in this building.
Yes, there is.
At least I have not seen it anywhere.
It's part of the esoteric school.
Is it downstairs? Well, I'm glad to hear that is there here. Because certainly from my own understanding, he was one of the greatest human beings on the planet's history. And then because I was coming from India, it was just assumed that I was a Hindu And therefore, occasionally they would invite me to have a Hindu-Christian dialogue. And since I just said that because of my adversity to studying anything about religion, I had not really studied anything about Hinduism. But now I felt obliged to learn something about it. In fact, I learned more about Hinduism in 1 year in Canada than in my 23 years in India, because I went absolutely out of my way to study the various scriptures and try to understand it deeply. First of all, I was particularly struck by Vivekananda more than almost anybody else in India. Some of you probably have heard his name. Vivekananda was a very great monk. In fact, often his portraits are underneath, they say, the Hindu monk of India. It's a very common expression about Vivekananda. And then I was very struck by one of his remarks that he, first of all, just to tell you, when Vivekananda became a monk, he wanted to travel on foot across India, starting from South India all the way up. He took only 2 books with him. One was the Bhagavad Gita, and the second book was Imitatio Christi, Imitation of Christ, the English translation of that. Those were the only 2 books that he took with him. And he makes this remark that in the whole human history, there has been no human as close to God as Jesus Christ lived. And that if I were present in Jerusalem with Christ, I would have washed his feet not only with water, but with the blood of my heart. This is a direct quote from Vivekananda. Because anybody who actually sees or studies, not sees, but studies what Christ said, what he did, how he lived, could hardly not appreciate the wisdom, the depth, and the grandeur of this human being, and could truly, in fact, say the Father and I are one, even though it's not permitted in the Abrahamic tradition. But there is also a lot of, some of you may have even seen BBC film, etc., saying that he studied in a Buddhist monastery, etc. There is even his grave in Srinagar in Kashmir. So there are many stories like this, but nobody really knows this clearly, and certainly the church won't allow this to be said. So then, because I try to study more and more deeply and clearly about the Hindu tradition, because often I had to speak as a Hindu to a Christian and listening to a Christian as a Hindu, that kind of debate. This is what gradually then led me to study more and more deeply, particularly the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita, in my judgment, and I am sure my friend here would agree, is perhaps the single most important text to emerge from India. Because it really conveys in practical way exactly what it is that a human being ought to practice or to live accordingly. So I highly recommend that text to people interested in it. Then, of course, among the various people that I met there, even in the physics department, most of them were not, as I said, interested in studying religion, or they thought it was crazy for me to go to church periodically because I wanted to learn something about Christianity. But there were obviously 1 or 2 serious searchers. And in particular, one person who had been brought up in the Roman Catholic tradition, and he said, as a student, we had to make a confession practically every week for our sins and go to the priest and confess our sins. And he would say, well, say Hail Mary 15 times or 20 times, and then you can go skiing. And so he said, what we had to do was to meet with another friend, say, well, this week you confess this sin, next week I will confess this sin, so that we can then say just Hail Mary. He says, this is how they grow up as Christians. This is from the Roman Catholic background. I don't know whether this is true for every other tradition, but. And gradually, he was becoming more and more discouraged with, if this is the only thing in the name of religion, that I am just sinful, he can't possibly believe what sins I have recently committed. He said, sure, I do something wrong occasionally, but that is not a sin in any big sense. So he gradually somehow became more interested in studying other religions, and he was actually very struck by the Hindu tradition, particularly for him. Partly because he also tried to practice in a sort of a yoga group, some yoga, and he says, although we were just basically doing physical yoga, but occasionally afterwards we would sit in meditation for a few minutes. He said on occasions, I really felt touched by something very serious. And then he got gradually more and more interested in studying something in the Hindu tradition. And he was then also very struck by many people from the Christian tradition who had been to India and who had made some remarks about it. For example, Father Bede Griffith, some of you probably know his name, who lived in India for many years actually. He makes this remark, which had very much struck this friend of mine, that Hinduism is not only talking about beliefs, but it is talking about the ways to liberation. So that is the kind of thing which struck him very much more about it. So he therefore started getting more and more interested in studying in Hinduism as I got more and more interested in studying in Christianity. So we often used to speak with each other and therefore could learn each other's, both what we find as something just becomes load in, there is actually a remark of Guruji, every stick has two ends. Very strong emphasis in the whole of the Judeo-Christian tradition to take care of this world, even in the Lord's Prayer. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But there is the other side of it. Since the 16th century, the whole planet has been ruled by people of Christian background, taking care of the earth. And in England in particular, the moment somebody becomes a king or they become head of the church. So spiritual power and secular power has been very much merged together. Perfect example of that is England more than anywhere else. Whereas in the Indian tradition, there is a very strong separation between the two. In fact, even classically, if a priest came to the door of a king or in the court of a king, the king will stand up and will bow to him. So there has been a very clear separation between the secular and the spiritual powers in the Hindu tradition, but very much mixed up in the Christian tradition. So one then soon begins to discover that there are wonderful things. On the other hand, it is also true. For example, even when, the Christian powers try to control India, even destroying many temples, etc. But at the same time, they also started orphanages or hospitals or schools for poor people, etc. So there is that side also. One soon discovers that everything, actually, every stick has two ends. There is one side and the other side. And for example, in Hinduism, what has happened, all this great idea that all is one, everybody has Brahma in it. But a Brahman cannot even stand the shadow of a Shudra in front. Shudra, you probably all know, is the lowest class of people. So actually Vivekananda, the same person that I quoted earlier, makes this remark that the Brahmins have made Hinduism into don't touchism. This is not my remark, this is Vivekananda's remark. So it's very nice to have grand ideas, but what is the practice? If the Brahmins have made Hinduism into don't touchism, and in fact a complete freedom from this world, Shankara, who is very highly regarded philosopher, sage in the Hindu tradition, made a remark called Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya, literally meaning Brahma is real or true, and the whole manifested universe is just illusion. Therefore, forget about this. And those of you who have been to India, I'm sure are struck by the fact every person will keep their house very nice and clean inside, but the neighborhood, nobody gives a damn what's taking place there. There is no suggestion about loving one's neighbor. I'm partly trying to indicate some of the contrasting emphasis that strikes one as you come across these religious traditions. On the other hand, it is true that this remark of Vivekananda that Brahmins have made Hinduism into don't touchism, then there is a very strong emphasis as if one needs to just move away from this world. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, much to my surprise actually, Krishna makes this remark that those who are really enlightened, they are never born again. Buddhism very much tried to correct this. In fact, some of you are familiar with the Bodhisattva vow, which actually literally says that they will be born again and again until every blade of grass is enlightened. Not to be sure, that is impossible. but nevertheless, the vow indicates their willingness to come again and again to be born again until every blade of grass is enlightened. But Buddhism tried that very hard, but for varieties of reasons, largely because of Islamic invasions, Buddhist monasteries were destroyed, etc. So Buddhism didn't succeed in India very much. So gradually one then begins to discover that really what is at the heart of the whole enterprise, a spiritual enterprise, is impartial self-inquiry. Because the call everywhere is that until I can be free of me, I cannot come to something real. We can, I think even in my previous talk, I gave many quotations. For example, Christ saying, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. Sometimes it gets expressed much more strongly, unless you die to yourself or unless you die to the world. It gets expressed in varieties of ways. But there is always the very strong suggestion or a call that unless I can be free of my own self-acquisition, my own approval or disapproval or my fear of disapproval, what gets called basically all kinds of desires. Some of you, of course, I'm sure everybody here knows, the Buddha was tested by Mara. Essentially, first of all, he sends his daughters to seduce him. That doesn't work. Then he says, I will turn this mountain into a mountain of gold. Then that didn't work. Then I will give you sovereignty over the whole world. Similar remarks, particularly about sovereignty over the whole world, you see Satan testing Christ. Then the other side is fear, trying to kill him. So fear and selfish desires are the fundamental occupation of almost every human being. And the call in any spiritual practice is how to be more and more free of my fears and desires. It gets expressed in varieties of ways. You can read any remarks of Christ and you will come across this kind of thing, or of the Buddha, or of Krishna, or anybody who engages you as a serious spiritual teacher. So increasingly I find, first of all, this notion that various religions are, sure, at the level of the religions, there is no search for anything. In fact, I made this remark the other day. Religions have done more harm to spiritual search than almost anything else. The more organized the religion becomes, more harm it does. Because it just wants you to believe this or that, or subscribe to this or that, and not to actually undertake the search. No search is easy. partly because this search requires facing the Satan in me. In principle, all spiritual teachings would agree, but even the modern scientific people would agree. In principle, the whole external cosmos is mirrored inside me. Each one of us is a hologram of the whole cosmos. So why not the Satan? He's also there. So is God. He's also there. And when one faces the Satan, one wants to run away or deny this. I'm not satanic. Which is the reason why any serious teaching organization very much insists that it is very important to undertake one's search with fellow searchers. For example, in Buddhism, as you know, three very classical expressions: Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha, in the teaching of the Buddha. It's in Pali, Dhammam. It comes from dharma in Sanskrit. And Sangham means community. Similarly, in Christianity, one forgets that the word ecclesia in early Greek actually means community of those who are called. It gradually just got translated into church. But it's the community of those who are called. The reason for suggesting this is because then one begins to see that deep down, what I discover about myself is actually the situation of all human beings. Satan is not only in me, or the divine energy is not only in me, it's in everybody. And if one is therefore working with some fellow searchers, one is not so disheartened. One doesn't think as if I alone have got the Satan in me. So it's a very strong suggestion in any serious searchers group to work with other fellow searchers. Because then one discovers both the divine energy in one as well as the satanic energy in one, and finding their appropriate place. Remember, I need to remind people, particularly of Christian background, do carefully read the book in which Christ actually explicitly says that when all the sons of God were gathered together, there was Satan. He's also a son of God. He didn't create himself. He's created by God. And he is actually called to examine everybody who is on a spiritual journey. So he's the head examiner. If I become against the Satan, he'll flunk me. So it's not a good idea to be against the Satan, but to find what he's trying to say. The word Satan in Hebrew and Mara in Pali both mean obstacle. They point out what stands in my way. If I take it seriously, then the Satan can actually point out what is standing in my way and how I can possibly overcome it. And therefore, if I begin to actually understand that Satan is also a son of God, not having created himself, he's being sent by God to test this. Especially, I highly recommend to all of you, especially of Christian background, to read the book of Job. This is how it goes. It's repeated twice in the first chapter and the second chapter. When all the sons of God were gathered together, among them was Satan. This is not my remark. This is in the book of Job. And God then asks Satan to test Job, who is claiming to be a great worshipper of God. So gradually one discovers that self-study or self-inquiry, there are many words for this. Swadhyay is the Sanskrit word. Now, this is another reason I just wanted to mention here, how cultures degenerate. If you look at the contemporary Sanskrit English dictionary, the first meaning of Swadhyay they give is reading sacred books. There is no complexity about this word. It's Swadhyay, meaning self-study. But this is the third or the fourth meaning now. In fact, I remember a conversation on one exchange. I was mentioning this to Krishnamurti, and he didn't use this language in public very much. He says, "Damn it, sir, what is the point of studying sacred books unless you study the book of yourself?" This is Krishnamurti. So you see how the cultures degenerate, as if Swadhyay has become studying sacred books rather than what it absolutely clearly simply means, self-study. Honest self-investigation, if you like, many other self-study, self-inquiry, self-observation, many words get used to translate this. But then gradually, as I said to you, that whatever I say may seem all very arrogant about me. Personally, having been somewhat disillusioned with what goes on in the name of technology, just we could get some more oil, get some more money, but I wasn't really studying the laws of nature, investigating the universe. But then I gradually discovered in physics, it's all completely externally oriented. It doesn't study the inside. Then I thought maybe philosophy will do it. Now, later on I shifted to religion. If you're interested, I could tell you more details how I ended up shifting, but I can hardly believe it myself. I had a postdoctoral fellowship in physics at the University of Toronto, postdoctoral fellowship in philosophy at Princeton, postdoctoral fellowship in religion at Columbia University. I was so fed up with the academic world, I resigned, because nothing was leading me to what I could understand as spiritual understanding. So I retired 2 years before I was expected to retire. But meanwhile, fortunately, having encountered, for example, I first met Krishnamurti without knowing who he was. So I wasn't looking for him, but just accidentally met him. And some of you probably have heard me describe this earlier, but maybe I quickly mention this. The lady I had married in Canada had earlier been a volunteer in India. And when she had gone there, she was posted in a Krishnamurti school in Rajghat, Varanasi. Some of you probably know the school there. So after I graduated in 1965 from the University of Toronto, having had a postdoctoral fellowship there, so went back to India, and she wanted to just give something to the lady there who had initially welcomed her, but she could not go herself. So I took something on a bicycle and I go there, and it's a big house. And those of you who have been in India, very rich people can have some very large houses, and some chowkidar is sitting there in front guarding the place. So somebody was sitting there and I thought it was a chowkidar. Chowkidar meaning somebody who's taking care of the building. So I asked him if the lady was home. He said, "I'm not sure." So he goes inside. Meanwhile, I'm looking at him. He seemed like a very striking person. But nevertheless, he was just behaving like a chowkidar. So he goes inside, comes back. He says, she's not here, but you can wait for half an hour. But having just come from Canada, half an hour was too long to stay. And this is the very, very Western idea. So I decided to go back, but I was on a bicycle, but I kept looking at him. And there were some goats coming from the other side, and I fell down my bicycle. Next day, we went to Varanasi because we were supposed to meet Krishnamurti there, because my wife, who was now my wife, earlier she had come as a volunteer, she had been teaching in that school. And so the principal there was obviously welcoming her and therefore said, "Of course you could meet Krishnamurti tomorrow when you come." So when we went there, we went to meet Krishnamurti. I was completely surprised that this was the man who I met yesterday. And he seemed much taller than me yesterday, but he was actually shorter than me. So it just indicates the kind of experience I had meeting somebody like him. Similarly, Jean de Salzman, who was person responsible for Gurdjieff's teaching after his death in 1949, I worked very closely with her for about 10 years. In fact, in my personal experience, she was the most exalted person I have ever met. And I also met her without knowing who she was. And so what forces are there in one's life that arrange who you meet, what books you read, what you do, but something deep down in one. What is searching? I'm inviting you all here to really seriously see this. It's all very nice to say spiritual search. How does it manifest itself in you? Of course, studying books, meeting people, but keep in mind, I'm not running my life wholly by myself. That would be completely crazy to imagine, as if I created this breath in me. It's not my breath which is keeping me alive. I would not even know how to make my nails. How could I possibly make this breathing apparatus? Or make the air that I need to breathe to. If I simply realize these obvious facts about one's existence, I cannot possibly be alive by my own choice. What forces are at play which have made me, which are keeping me alive only for a few decades in a universe which is trillions of years old now? Then one wonders, how do I connect with this energy? How do I understand what I am called to do? Why have I been created? Is it just accidental? Pointless? Or is there any purpose to my existence? Certainly, from the general scientific point of view, everything begins from matter without any consciousness, etc. So there can be no purpose or anything. It's just all accidental. In fact, a very well-known Nobel Prize winner in quantum mechanics actually makes this remark: the more we study, the more we realize how pointless the whole universe is. From a spiritual point of view, every creature has a purpose for existence. And there is a divine energy which is wishing to be connected with, wishing to be related with deeper and deeper, and to follow. Not to try to lead this divine energy, but to follow this divine energy. This is the reason I mentioned yesterday that what is required is an attitude of prayer. What is the attitude of prayer? Namely, that I'm willing to receive something, not trying to command the divine energy to do something for me. But personally for me, don't take it, if it is not true for you, don't accept it. I think the posture of prayer actually interferes with your breathing. Try it. If you have been practicing yoga, you can try it. So I don't recommend the posture of prayer, but highly the attitude of prayer and the posture of meditation, which really invites us to become more and more receptive and deeper look inside, and to become more and more receptive requires more and more freedom from my anxiety and from my fear. That automatically requires more and more relaxation, literally physical relaxation, because this may not be true for you, but as I more and more seriously look at myself, all my tensions arise from self-assertion or fear. So to be free of my tensions, meaning to be more and more relaxed, requires more and more freedom from self-assertion, which is the call from all great teachers. to be free of me, so that I can be actually touched by these divine energies. So deeper and deeper relaxation, not only physically, but also emotionally, by which I mean not wishing to be the right person, or am I even sitting rightly? It doesn't even matter. Especially when one is connected with something really spiritual, then even the posture doesn't matter. Look at Raman Maharishi. Terrible posture. But that doesn't mean he's not connected with something real. But otherwise, person like Vivekananda or Aurobindo or Krishnamurti, you look the way they sit. So something is required from our side, but it's actually a remark in the Bible of St. Paul's remark. He who is connected with the Holy Spirit is above the law. These various laws then don't apply. This one is connected with the Holy Spirit. But until one is connected with the Holy Spirit, it is important to try to see what is the right posture, what is the right books to study, what should I try, what I should refrain from, what I should eat. It's all of these various requirements, because they are all affecting my whole attitude. So for me, the whole spiritual search, even to say East and West, ultimately really lead to something very similar in practice. Of course, they get expressed differently. There is, for example, in the Indian tradition, very much emphasis, don't worry about this world here, it's the other world. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, taking care of this world becomes important, but both are required. Otherwise, one can get stuck either only exclusively here and not realize that there is something subtler than what we experience or what we see. On the other hand, if one is so occupied with the other side, then one doesn't take care of the people here on the planet Earth. This is the reason yesterday when I made my presentation, I tried to show how each tradition ends up having its grandeur, but almost automatically it has its negative side. But simple reminder, at the very best, any spiritual teaching or religion, if you like, is like a finger pointing to the moon. But if you get so stuck to the finger, you will never get to the moon. So I highly recommend to look at more than one finger. It can help you to locate the moon, but still you have to leave those fingers to get to the moon. Thank you so much.
You mentioned that in Indian tradition, or in the Hindu tradition, I think you said, that there was always a very distinct separation of the state and religion or religious practice. And is that still the case in India in the present time, where I hear that there is quite a bit of concern about that?
No, at present time, in fact, this has been true really throughout history, but at the models of the major guru or the major kings is what I said. On the other hand, it is true now, if you are a friend with a minister in the government, you can get a position even in the religious traditions that the others can't get. So that kind of tendency is very strong. In fact, it is after I finished my Ph.D. and when I went back to India, this was in 1965, I was there for almost a year and could not get a satisfactory job. But meanwhile, I had 3 job offers from Canada. This is why I returned to Canada then as an immigrant after that. But the reason why, in order to get a job, especially at that time it was even stronger, it's probably true even now, you needed to know somebody who is a big boss in the government. So that tendency is very strong, but I don't imagine it's only in India that tendency is very strong. If you know a big boss or a very wealthy person, you can get a position more easily than otherwise.
I appreciate your comments and your forthrightness. And I would like for you to extend that forthrightness to this question. You've made quite a point that spirituality, not institutional religion, but more of a spiritual responsibility, a spiritual sense, has a lot of responsibility, not only to know oneself, but to know the other as well. How do you relate that to our responsibility to address social justice?
Well, social justice really is, in a way, even your question implies that, is precisely to insist on that every human being needs to be regarded as a decent human being and should be treated correspondingly. Not just because he happens to be either rich or because he happens to know somebody who is wealthy or significant in the government, etc. So in a way, your very question actually already has that answer in it.
Why don't we do it then?
Just because we don't actually follow the spiritual teachings in general. My impression is spiritual teachings really require more and more freedom from me. And each one of us, right from birth onwards, especially in the schools onward, what takes place in the schools? You compete with each other so that you can get a better scholarship or go to a better college, etc. So this is how the whole education seems to be oriented towards that. At least that was the case when I went to school in India. I don't imagine much of this has changed. And so all our education system is competitively oriented. This is why then the whole society gets oriented towards that. And as I described earlier, not meaning to praise myself, but I obviously did well competitively. So I ended up having this scholarship, that scholarship, etc. But on the other hand, at some stage, one also realizes that whatever in my case is called Ravi is only temporarily here. So then I seriously ask, why am I here? Then one begins to listen to something slightly differently than, am I here just to get more money or to get more honor? In fact, somebody was asking me yesterday, are you now working on another book? I said, I'm not really interested in publishing any other. Richard was here, I think, Richard Smalley. He was asking me if I'm writing another article or something. But sometimes I say something and then somebody wants to publish it. So they insist on me giving the references, etc. I said, I'm just saying something that makes sense to me. I don't have any references here. You don't want to have. And in fact, I was just giving him this example. Tamanos Academy is a big academy in England, started by Charles when he was Prince Charles. Now he's the king. They invite me periodically to give a talk. So 2 years ago, I had spoken there the talk was Love as a Cosmological Force. That was the topic of my talk. And there, some people were very struck and they wanted to publish this in their journal, Tamanos Academy. So I said, okay, go ahead, publish. Now, of course, some things have struck me, what Plato said or what Plotinus may have. Some people philosophers I admire are very few. But then what some people have said, or then they asked me to give the precise reference. I said, to hell with it, don't publish it. I don't care, because I'm not interested in getting more publications. What do I get from that? So this editor offered to do the reference, find the references himself. He spent a week finding all the references. And then, even to my surprise, he quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, not using my translation, but some other book that, that had interested him. But in any case, so they published it. So the reason I'm mentioning this, I'm increasingly not really interested in publishing this or that, or getting this honor or that honor. More and more interest is how can it possibly assist me to become more and more free of myself, and if in that process of speaking to others, it calls them for some spiritual search.
Now, you may be ready for this. There is a question that we received from someone online. Here it comes. Is there a theosophical or Hindu equivalent to the Christian saying, pray for your enemies? How can we shift our hearts to pray for political leaders who we consider enemies? Is there a role for rage?
Well, certainly, if one takes the example from the Bhagavad Gita, there, first of all, let me just remind you, especially since my guru here is a scholar of the Bhagavad Gita, she may disagree with me, but twice in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna speaks about acting without hinsa. Hinsa means violence. So what has become ahimsa, meaning non-violence? Literally, it should be translated as non-violation. Just to give you a very side example, about 5 years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada actually passed a judgment, which later on they had to rescind, because a woman may feel offended even though the skirt is not torn, there is no bruise on her legs or on her hips, but she's feeling offended. They said, so there is not violence in the usual sense of the word, but she is violated. So I actually recommend strongly that the word ahimsa should be translated as non-violation, because one can be violated even emotionally. Supposing I say to her, unless you marry me, I'm going to commit suicide. You see what happens? So one needs to be very careful about these words. And therefore, the suggestion that one needs to be free of violation or violence, but Krishna is asking Arjuna to kill people without violence or violation. Now, isn't that interesting? Because their violation is destroying the right order. From Krishna's point of view, so killing somebody who is interfering with the right cosmological order is not hinsa or not violence. So therefore, in this, the question that is being raised, how do we treat with these people who are behaving wrongly? There maybe one needs to not only vote against them, if necessary, to spend money, if people are in the political party where they can contribute some funds, etc. So whatever action is required, as long as you're actually not doing it for self-gain or self-importance, but corresponding to the right, relatively speaking, cosmological order. Why would Krishna bother to ask Arjuna to actually go and fight and kill, but still maintaining the right order?
Great answer.
Vedanta.
Well, I'd like to ponder a bit and ask you about this exoteric and esoteric side of religion. When in the West we study Hinduism and Buddhism, we are somehow going to the esoteric side of it. We are not on the outer parts of rituals and so on. And I guess that when in the East, they study Christianity. They also take the deepest part of it, not the rituals, not the prejudices, and not so on. And in the case of Christianity, I have been following the last 15 years. Well, the distance between esoteric and exoteric became a gap too big. And in the last 15 years, maybe because the churches felt threatened, they started publishing treasures that were in occult inside the monasteries and so on. So we are getting a lot of precious things from Christianity that wasn't not available externally. And well, how do you see that? Do you think that you got the deeper part of Christianity and Hinduism? Do you think you got the external part of it? How do you deal with this? How can I say this? Dichotomy of very public things and what is kept inside the monasteries.
No, that is actually very important question, because it is true that when one looks at another religion from a distance, one is just drawn to the more esoteric part or more interesting part of it. And increasingly, this is the main reason why more and more people are leaving or getting away from organized religion everywhere, not only in Christianity. This is true. I see most of my Indian friends, younger than me or my age, they are no longer interested in going to the temples or doing this or that at all. But this is where one has to be very careful. First of all, it is true that when we look at another tradition, we are just drawn only to the nicer part of it. You're calling more esoteric part of it. Whereas we look at the details of our own religious tradition and see all the terror in it. But increasingly, as people travel, they see what goes in the name of Hinduism in India. A rich palace, next to it, slums. You can go to a big fancy hotel there and get the fanciest food, but people outside are begging for food. But so as people travel, they become more familiar of both sides of their religion, what's taking place there. That's one aspect. The other is, there is no harm in, if I am struck by, let us say, coming from the Hindu tradition, if I am struck by the esoteric part of Christianity, then I also begin to wonder what is the esoteric part in my own religious background. Increasingly for me, in fact, I have even put this in writing in some place or the other, I was born a Hindu. This is just by, if I was born in Saudi Arabia, I'll be called a Muslim. If I'm born in India, I'm called a Hindu. It's just a label people attach to it because where you happen to be born or what your parental religious background is. It's not that I chose to be a Hindu or that I knew anything about Hinduism. I decided this is the best religion in the world, so I want to be a Hindu. This is not how one chooses anything. In Canada now, even now, we have holidays at Christmas and Easter, not when the Buddha was enlightened. So the kids going to school, they are more aware of the Christian hymns, etc., not what goes on in the name of Buddhism or Hinduism or anything else. So it is inevitable that in every society, certain things get emphasized and encouraged. And increasingly, global culture is one way of becoming free of it. But also every individual then begins to realize that in every teaching or every religion, if you like, there are many levels. Anybody coming from the Christian background will be surprised the amount of terror that has been created in the name of Christianity. There are 3 billion Christians now in the world. Putin is one of them. Trump is another one. There are many Christians like this. Similarly, many of the so-called Hindu gurus are now in jail. And I think I mentioned this yesterday, that 40% of the elected members of parliament now in India have criminal records against them. And they have names like Rama and Krishna. These are their names. So one then begins to see that the human situation everywhere is full of all levels. Everywhere there are very few serious, wise people. I personally actually ask myself honestly, out of 8 billion people, how many do you think are searching for something? Maybe 1%. But then impartially I ask myself, do I search for anything more than 1% of my time? One then begins to see that self-inquiry gradually shows one the whole situation of the humankind. But self-study or self-inquiry is the mechanism of self-transformation. In fact, personally, I have tried to emphasize this very often in my writings also. I don't know any other mechanism of transformation, self-transformation. Occasionally it is said, for example, in the case of Vivekananda, that he came to his guru, Ramakrishna, and he touched him and he was transformed. Maybe that is possible. I have met some very remarkable gurus like Krishnamurti or Jean the Salesman, and they sure as hell touched me, hugged me. Several people have said who were close to Krishnamurti that they never saw him hug anybody as often as he hugged me. I haven't been transformed by that. But theoretically it gets said. Personally, I actually believe that the only mechanism of transformation is impartial self-inquiry. If I see closely that I am greedy, gradually one becomes free of greediness. Because this is a very important aspect. Let me take a moment here. Even Einstein makes this remark in studying physics, that wherever the problem is, the sight needs to be brought from a higher level. If I see that I am greedy and I want to immediately fix it, I may even temporarily succeed for a day or so. No, if I see from a higher level, that means a stronger energy in me, then gradually that higher energy is able to shift what takes place at the lower level in me. In fact, this is a very significant transformational idea. Let me take a moment here. If I honestly begin to see something in me, it is endless, because in principle the whole cosmos is mirrored inside me. Every scientist would agree with this. So if the whole cosmos is mirrored inside me, it's endless. Therefore, there comes a stage in one's search when one is less interested in what I see, more interested in the quality of my seeing. If the Buddha was seeing something, sure as hell, it will be much clearer and much better than my seeing. So how do I develop the quality of my seeing? That becomes more important than what I see. Because what I see is absolutely endless. The whole universe is there. If you actually undertake the journey of self-transformation, you will find almost everything I'm saying is just absolutely obvious. In fact, I often keep saying to my friends, why do they invite me to speak? Everything I say is just plainly obvious. Why does it need to be said? But most people don't seem to realize that it is plainly obvious. more and more clear perception. By clear, I mean coming from a higher and higher level, brings about a radical transformation in the quality of one's being. What do you think, how was the Buddha transformed? Sat there fasting for long. You could see his back from his front. These are the images in India, especially in Sarnath. That didn't help. But then he sits in quiet meditation, watching more and more closely what is there. Deeper and deeper insight. That brings about a transformation. And he also sees, this is one of his remarks before he actually became enlightened. He says, Mara, you are a part and parcel of myself. Mara is Satan. Mara is the Pali word for Satan. Mara, you are a part and parcel of myself. This is what the Buddha said. And what did Christ say? He didn't ask the Satan to go to hell or to disappear. He said, get thee behind me, Satan. Help from behind. You don't need to take my word for it. Read the Gospel of Matthew. Get thee behind me, Satan. These Satans or obstacles pointing out have enormous amount of power. They can be helpful. They can be hindrances. Depends on where they are.
I have a two-part question regarding your relationship with Krishnamurti. What was it like to be in his presence? And what was the most valuable lesson or insight you received?
That's a very important question. I had actually heard him so often, and also I should make a slightly background remark here. Every great teacher repeatedly says much the same thing. There is always a strong tendency to focus on one major thing. So I had heard him so often that I could actually complete his sentence. But why would I still go there to meet him? Because in his presence, there was a different radiation. Each one of us, not only Krishnamurti, actually each one of us is receiving vibrations the whole time and putting out vibrations the whole time. Even at a very ordinary level, even a dog is doing this, or a cat is doing this. So this is nothing fancy about us, but human beings are doing this. But the question really is, what is the quality of that radiation? In his presence, at least when I was there, I felt even myself temporarily transformed. But of course, I go back and I return to my usual selfish self. That's a different matter. So why would one go there? Precisely because there is a shift that takes place in his presence. Now, some of this can be felt just by reading what he said. Personally, for me, his presence was much more radiant and much more effective than what he says, because the language has its own problems. In fact, he often says very contradictory things. If you like, I remind you of something here quickly. You interested in this experience of mine? This is in I have to recall this, the year 1981, I think. I was actually chairing a meeting in Hawaii and returning home. I live in Nova Scotia, Halifax, so I had to change aeroplanes overnight in Los Angeles. And Ojai, as you know, is about an hour and a half drive from Los Angeles, and that's where Krishnamurti used to live. So I phoned Mary Zimbalist. Some of you probably know the name of Mary Zimbalist. She was the one, I sometimes called her, don't repeat this, I sometimes called, she was Krishnamurti's nanny, taking care of him. But that may not be the right way to speak publicly. But she took care of him very much. And so I called her, is Krishnamurti there? So if he's there, because I'll then come there and stay overnight at Ojai. She said, he's here, but this is not a good time to come because he is absolutely exhausted. He has given several public lectures, and he always spoke with great passion. If any of you heard him in person, he spoke with a great passion, and that he's very much tired. So I was feeling a little sad. So after a little while, she calls me back. She said I had spoken to him, and he's very eager to speak to me or to see me. So come, but promise that you won't raise anything serious. So I promised that I won't raise anything serious. So we are sitting, especially next day. My wife was also with me. At the lunch time, I'm sitting on his left side, and my wife is sitting opposite him, Mary Zimbalist on his right side. And throughout his lunch, he kept holding my right hand. Wasn't eating very much. And coming from India, I'm not accustomed to eating with my left hand. It's actually more or less forbidden in India to eat with your left hand. So I hardly could eat very much because he kept holding my hand throughout the lunchtime. And then something emerged. Meanwhile, I was trying to say, oh, Krishnaji, it's such a nice day. We'll go for a walk, trying to be as superficial I could manage to be in his presence. But something, there, as I said, one is not wholly in charge of one's life. From where something comes, something emerged from me. I ended up saying, Krishnaji, it seems to me that every impression leaves a mark on our body at a cellular level. He looked at me, he says, he had a habit of saying, sir, should we go into it? Then he sends somebody to bring a recorder, and Mary Zimbalist is looking at me with dragon eyes because I have obviously betrayed my promise. But then I tried to say, Krishna, we'll speak about it after lunch. Not now. No, we have to speak about it. This is an important issue. So he sends a tape recorder, and so now we have a conversation. But I felt so bad afterwards, having betrayed my promise, that soon after I left and I had to rent a place in Los Angeles to live overnight, 3 days later, a phone rings in my house. My wife answers the phone. She says, the sound sounds familiar but very formal. He's asking, may I speak to Professor Ravindra? Nobody calls me Professor Ravindra. This is not the practice in the USA or Canada. But he is very formally. It's Krishnamurti on the phone. I have no idea where he got my phone number or why was he calling me. He says, so when I answer, he said, what you said 3 days ago, I have been thinking about it. Remember, he often used to say, right away you come to a conclusion or a decision. What you said 3 days ago, I have been thinking about it. Can you come and see me for half an hour? Now I am 4,000 kilometers away. And the next week, I had a meeting in London, England. So I flew from Halifax to London via Los Angeles. Because an iron filing cannot resist the draw of a magnet. So then we had a whole very interesting conversation. He wanted me to take charge of the foundation, etc. I don't want to go into the details of this, but the fact is that in his presence, one had a very different impression, different understanding than just reading something or hearing something. I don't know whether I speak to your question.
That was the first question.
What's the next one?
The second question was, what was most valuable teaching or insight?
Sari, what is the?
What was the most valuable teaching that you received?
From Krishnamurti. He very strongly emphasizes self-inquiry. In fact, one of his remarks is, and I'm directly quoting it, there can be no wisdom without self-inquiry. Unless you know what stands in your way, what distracts you, there is no way you can understand anything. So he very strongly recommended that. But in general, he had this, somehow he got stuck with this idea as if the TS was promoting certain practices or certain way, And he repeatedly kept saying, there is no way to the truth. In fact, I even asked him on one occasion, there may be no way from here to there, but is there a way from there to here? Because all serious teachings have to come from there, not from here. We have biblical expressions like this as well. And he says, that's what I have been teaching for the last 60 years. That's what, but he says, of all the people, especially the scientists, don't understand this. I'm quoting him directly. In fact, the Krishnamurti Foundation in India had asked for me to write an article. They published it, I think, 2 years ago or something, where I mentioned some of these things. This is published by the Krishnamurti Foundation of India. And so, in general, he was against proposing or promoting a particular practice. But in his remarks, he very often ends up suggesting self-inquiry in one way or the other. Otherwise, he had almost the impression that one can get stuck. In one of his famous remarks is, it's a pathless, what did they say?
Pathless path. The pathless path?
Pathless path or something like this, the remark.
Who's got the right saying?
It's a pathless land.
Yeah, truth in the pathless land, that's right. So he was therefore against any path. But what he is really, in fact, very much emphasizing, this is strongly recommended by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, to become free of one's action. In fact, one of the remarks in the Bhagavad Gita is, an advanced yogi sees that I do nothing at all. What is called nashkarmya in Sanskrit, actionlessness. But that is not inaction. It is that that action is not being undertaken by my desire, my will, my gain, but can my action become an instrument of Krishna's will? That is the call. My personal impression is that that is really what Krishnamurti wanted to emphasize, not taking one's action for one's own self-gain, but it just ends up being no action, no path. So one can get too occupied with this at a low level. But this is true with every religious expression, is understood by people at whatever level they are. Same remarks of Christ can be understood by every character who is a great sage or somebody who is a real scoundrel. The same expression can be understood differently.